everybody. Raul here for Bass Musician Magazine, and today we have the great honor and pleasure of chatting with Jim Kerwin. Yay!
Glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Raul.
Oh, my pleasure, Jim. So, many of us have seen you or heard you playing with David Grisman, the Nell and Jim Band. We'll definitely talk about those projects, but we always like to go back to the past. How did you get started in music, and particularly on bass?
Well, that's a long time ago because I'm an old guy now, but I remember pretty well. Basically, probably very common even with your story, the Ed Sullivan Show and the Beatles. And me looking at four individuals who were totally fascinating. The music obviously was fascinating, but there were individual players in that band. I wanted to be in a band. I wanted to be part of a band. Mm-hmm. And I played the guitar. I had found a guitar on the wall of a local music shop, a big bright red Kent electric guitar, and convinced my mother that I wanted to take lessons. And reluctantly, she allowed me to do that. And I was probably 7 or 8, maybe around then. And the teacher was interesting because he was actually in the movies in his past as a singing cowboy guitar player. You know, he was actually in movies.
Wow.
So he had that style, kind of a Chet Atkins thing. Mm-hmm. So he liked to play instrumental, the chord melodies. Mm-hmm. And he taught me chords, how to strum and play through chord shapes. And I totally picked that up really quickly. And we would spend the whole time have him playing through tunes, like Peg of My Heart. And I could just remember all of these old tunes that, I didn't really care about, but I was learning how to play rhythm behind those melodies. And my mother would come and pick me up after the lesson. She says, well, that's fine, but when are you going to teach Jimmy to play some melodies?
Yeah.
And I hadn't even thought about that because I was in the middle of learning these chords, and I loved it. I loved the idea of accompanying someone and following along and being part of that ensemble. Then when I saw the Beatles, I thought, wow, there's a whole thing. You could do that with a band. And everybody in my neighborhood and probably the world was thinking the same thing. And there was probably 17 bands in my town of San Bruno, California, here in the Bay Area. And I played the guitar, but hardly anyone played the bass. Yeah. So I found an old Westbrook electric bass and joined about 3 different bands. And that's when I realized, wow, I can do this. I mean, I'm just converting what I learned playing those chord patterns to bass lines, and I knew how to make a groove just kind of instinctively. So I was never taught anything, and that went on for years through high school. I had really fine bands that were started through high school. We were copying all of the San Francisco sound, like Quicksilver Messenger Service. Mm-hmm. We would play those tunes and various other things that were going on at the time. And that was a golden era for music. And being in the Bay Area, I would get on a Greyhound bus and go up to Haight Street or go to the Fillmore and go to see Winterland. And Bill Graham was the most incredible purveyor of various sorts of music. And I would see the original Fleetwood Mac with Peter Green playing that blues. Mm-hmm. And 10 years after, on the same bill as Buddy Rich Big Band. Wow. And I would see the drummers, like Mick Fleetwood, standing next to the stage with me as a kid, maybe, I don't know how old I was back then, but maybe 15, 16. And they were in awe of watching Buddy Rich, and that was the first time I'd ever seen jazz performed. And this is Bill Graham presenting these things for his audience intentionally to spread, all these different styles. And I would see my heroes from the rock groups be in total awe of this giant taking the most incredible drum solos. Yeah. So those are moments I have many moments of that golden era of San Francisco jazz, not jazz, but just the whole music scene. Mm-hmm. And many, anyway, so that inspired me. And then just realizing as a bass player, I could fit into many different groups. Then I'll take it the next step forward. Then by the time I got into college, I was studying geology, and I love that whole world, and I love the earth, and I love science. But my teacher was smart enough to recommend that, well, if you're going to stay with geology and get a degree in geology, you're going to go into the oil companies.
Yeah.
That's where you're going to work, or you're going to be a teacher. And he knew that that's not what I was interested in, because he had heard me play music, and he knew how excited I was about music. And I also was building a guitar at the same time. I built my own classical guitar from scratch, and it was wonderful. I was thinking I was going to be an instrument builder.
Mm.
But then I realized that music was more important to me, and I was on a trip to Europe around, I guess I was in my early 20s. And I went to see the Bill Evans Trio playing in London. And it was a unique experience because Bill Evans, first of all, was very sick that night. Mm. And they set the piano up behind, way back of the stage, and had Eddie Gomez, the bass player, sitting right on the edge of the stage. And Eddie Gomez played all of the solos. Bill was green, sick. He was, he had liver problems at this point.
Yeah.
All based on his drug abuse. But I watched Eddie Gomez play that whole night in total awe, and I talked to him after. And I had bought a string bass earlier before I left on that trip, but I didn't know how to play it. I just had an opportunity to buy one. It was an old K bass, and I had that for many years. And I asked Eddie Gomez, how do I get to learn to be as good as you? Because I saw him play all the way up and down the neck and take all of these improvised solos, and that's what I wanted to do. And I asked for his help, and he told me, well, you could do it the way I was doing it, because there weren't many jazz teachers back then. I mean, there was no jazz curriculums in colleges or anything like that. And he said, well, just find yourself a really great classical teacher, learn the rules, and then you could break the rules. He said, this is a very physically difficult instrument to play. So that's what I was more interested in at that point, is learning to play. I fell in love with the acoustic bass. Yeah. I just love the visceral feel of it, and I love what it does in a jazz setting. And so I went back and studied at San Francisco State under a really great teacher by the name of Charles Ciani. And he's infamous in the world of bass. He's passed on now, but I have a lot of colleagues that still play in the classical world and jazz that studied with him, and all have stories about what a tough teacher he was. Yeah. Old Italian school, and he would just rip you apart, never say anything good. Unless you can get on his good side. That took years for me to get on his good side. But right before his lessons at San Francisco State, I started taking a yoga class. And I was able then to come into a lesson, very intense lessons he would give. And he would be smoking, and you'd see the other bass player leave the lesson room, and either they'd be in tears or just completely sweating, because he would just rip you apart. Yeah. And at the time, I just lost my mother to cancer, and I had helped her through that, and I had this force pushing me forward. And I wasn't going to let this guy tell me that I couldn't be a musician, which he actually did. He said, why do you want to be a musician? Because I could hardly read music at that point. Yeah. I was trying to be a beginner through this guy, and he had no patience for me until I started to relax and understand that, if I can get through this guy screaming at me, I can play in any situation. Because I know I really want to play music, and I want to be part of a band. I want to be the master of the groove. That's really what I want to do. And it didn't matter what style I was playing. And classical, orchestra playing is particular, especially with the bass. And there's a lot of skill, and people spend their whole lives just doing that, learning how to take bass auditions. And that's a whole. I realized early on that I could try to do that, but I wasn't really that motivated to do that. So after college and after getting a degree in solo performance on bass, playing Bach cello suites and the Eccles Sonata and all of the things, and the Hindemith Sonata, really wonderful music, but there's very little of it written for bass. So I realized okay, I'm not going to push this much further. I'm going to get into what I want to do. And I joined a band that toured Germany, mostly Germany, for 5 years. We did 12 tours over there, playing in a jazz trio, vibraphone, drums, and bass. And the vibraphone player, Larry Blackshear, was a true master of that instrument, both in classical and show music, but he was also a great writer and a really great improviser. So I learned a lot by being with him, and also discovered what great audiences there are in Europe. How they really wanted you to improvise. They want to see what I really want to do, which is experiment on stage and create something new each night.
Yeah.
And they encouraged that, so I kind of caught the bug, and that went on for 5 years. And just when that was, coming to an end, I met David Grisman, who is an incredible bluegrass mandolin player.
Mm-hmm.
And he had created a style about 10 years before, which I had paid attention to. And I had dug him when I first saw him play at the Great American Music Hall in San Francisco. I said, that's the kind of band I want to play in. Acoustic band, didn't have a drummer at that time. And that was interesting to me, because the bass player was really holding the groove. But it was all acoustic music, great solos. David allowed that as he arranged music so everyone would get a chance to solo, and it featured his very tight arrangements. And so 10 years after seeing him for the first time and being a fan, I met him at a jazz. He was trying to get more into jazz, as he was starting to play with Stefan Grappelli and Sven Asmussen, who are incredible, both past now, but great jazz violinists. So he was interested in that kind of, I guess you'd say it, European or gypsy jazz.
Sure.
And so he was looking for players like myself. And I happened to know his music just from being a fan, and I immediately connected. And 4 days later, I was in his band. And so that was 36 years ago, 1985. That was. That band changed. I stayed the bass player for that many years. Then I was introduced to a whole other world, not only this jazz thing that he was trying to get into, but also I worked on some really great bluegrass projects. The first Grammy-nominated record I was on was with Red Allen, and that was an incredible straight-ahead bluegrass record, where I had to go in not knowing anything about bluegrass. I knew it was simpler than jazz, but I didn't know just how to deal with it. I didn't realize that these old school players, they didn't count a tune off. There was no 1, 2, ready, go or something. It was just, they always played this introduction, and whether it was on the banjo or the mandolin, you just had to catch that. And as a matter of fact, that taught you what tune you were playing, whatever that introduction. It also told you what key it's in and the tempo.
Yeah.
No one said we're going to do, Home is Where the Heart Is in A, and it's going to be, nothing like this. Is a recording session.
Oh, wow.
But luckily I had gotten all of the changes, and I'd written out in Roman numerals whatever the changes of those tunes were. So I'm looking at Roman numerals and then gauging what key we're in. Anyway, it was my initiation into the real world of bluegrass players with great players. This was Porter Church on banjo and Red Allen on guitar and singing. And, I worked with Jimmy Buchanan and John Hartford and Vassar Clements, all of these great bluegrass players that come from that world, that don't talk about really keys or anything, technical that I had studied in classical. Mm-hmm. So I just kind of learned, trying to, emulate what they were doing. So that was a whole other experience. And David was kind of a translator into that world. And years later, with David, after being with his quintet and his quartet, occasionally. Sometimes it was a trio, but mostly it had that sound. That led to he reignited his friendship with Jerry Garcia.
Okay.
And they had worked for, they were good friends from a long time back, from when they both lived on the East Coast. And they both had a very similar love for traditional music, Americana, I guess you might call it.
Sure.
And that led to many, many different recording sessions, just impromptu recording sessions, which eventually came out in many different records of the Garcia Grisman band. And that was Jerry Garcia, David Grisman. Joe Craven was playing fiddle and mandolin and percussion, and I played bass. And I'm very proud of those recordings. And they were just, usually we didn't really have an intention to make a record, but they were just friends getting together in David's home studio. And many times it was just one or two takes of a tune. And my experience in playing jazz and just kind of like jumping in helped a lot. I was able to just try to just focus on what needs to be done here as a bass player. And so I learned very quickly not to play too many notes and to play, appropriately to support those artists. So that helped a lot. That was around 1980, the late 80s and into the 90s. 90s through, Jerry died in 95 or something like that. Mm-hmm. So it was the last 5 years of his life that I worked with him and really enjoyed meeting him. And, we were colleagues at the time, and I really admired his sense of being a musician. He loved music. He loved, just like I did, he loved to be playing in a band. And David and him shared, this passion for old tunes, and they would just look through books of lyrics and immediately create an arrangement and record a tune. And that was fascinating for me, just to watch them put that together. So I just followed along with that.
Very interesting. Well, and it is always fascinating how there are always influences as we go through time. When you're mentioning some gypsy jazz creeping over here or there, I think as we have better ways of music getting disseminated. I know, we start back in the day when there was just records themselves, but so much of what we heard was controlled by labels. So, if you weren't picked up by a label, or they would distribute to a particular area of the country, you might not have, you could have bluegrass only selling maybe to the South, and people in other places not hear it so much. And gypsy jazz, the whole European scene, they were so much more receptive, at least in my opinion, to a lot of what we were doing at the time. And they were kind of even more fanatical about it. And I've heard many musicians say, I felt so good playing in Europe because they were so enthusiastic, but it was the crowds in the States were just kind of harder. And I think a lot of it had to do with just the whole flow of people, what people heard, what people would get used to, what they would adapt to. But it's had a healthy infusion of new concepts and new thoughts, and it's the ongoing metamorphosis. And currently, bluegrass is very alive and well, and there's festivals, there's new groups coming on, there's kind of morphing as it gets introduced into what the country music. I guess I always think of like when they say country, I think of like Gene Autry or some of the older Chet Atkins kind of stuff. Yeah. But now it is a kind of a new thing, and there's things that are country, but they're actually kind of more bluegrass. But then you get some other influences, so it's all kind of a progression, which is so great that you've lived through that ongoing snowball of accumulation of musical concepts.
Yeah, sometimes I've questioned my broad tastes as far as professionally, because it's really difficult to nail me down, and people in all of those fields, the bluegrass players, they kind of remember, oh yeah, I played with David Grisman, but but I don't ever get recognized at a bluegrass, for awards. My name doesn't come up on those worlds because I play in bands that are kind of bucking the system. David Grisman was a music fusion, arranger. That's really what he was doing. And in the world of jazz, if you play with if you're known for playing with a bluegrass player like David Grisman, then it's like, well, that's not really music or whatever. Well, that was what was going on with David Grisman when he was trying to get into jazz. Downbeat magazine he would win awards as a miscellaneous instrument.
Wow.
So he won that a number of years, and so they started writing about him in the magazine. And so that's why he started thinking that he could get into playing jazz festivals. That was when I joined the band in '85. And we did. We played some jazz festivals, and it went over really big because the jazz audiences at those festivals thought, how refreshing to hear these sambas and Latin tunes and bluegrass, rhythms, and then a beautiful ballad that's basically a jazz style ballad, and it went over really well. But people that market music can't see those kind of gray areas as anything they could sell. It doesn't really brand very well.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm saying for myself. But I don't care. I got over that a long time ago.
There you go.
I'm not really in it to be recognized so much by the general audience or the people that sell music. I play to the band members or the other musicians first before I play to the audience. That's my criteria of paying attention is first of all, for me, to make sure I've rehearsed, that I'm playing, that I'm confident about what I'm doing, and then am I supporting everyone? Am I bringing the band together? Sure. Am I setting the groove or being part of that groove, that doing all of the elements that a bass player needs to do? And then I worry about whether the audience is picking up on any of this, because if I can do all of this first, the audience hopefully will realize, or whatever, subliminally realize, that there's something functioning here.
Well, and I think when you're playing to the other musicians, also when you do a little, and it doesn't have to be a huge thing, but even a little touch, a little something exceptional will capture their attention, and they'll go like, whoa, there you did that. And it may be something the audience never knew because they don't have anything to compare. This is the way we did do it, but now you've chosen to do this.
Right.
And it's...
music is, to me, is not necessarily entertainment because it's more of a magic trick, really. That's what I'm dealing with. I'm, just kind of emotions. I'm using my emotions. I'm capturing other people's emotions. But yeah, the music, it can be very broad as far as how the audience see. In fact, audiences come to see a band like I play with, and they're fascinated or they're entertained by watching the interaction of the musicians on stage. They're seeing little bits and pieces of us recognizing, oh, that was great. Oh, that part's coming up. This is exciting, whatever. And they're watching our faces. A really good music video captures that. Yeah. If they edit it right and all of that, it's capturing the spontaneous thing that's happening on stage. And in fact, I think that bands that are too rehearsed or too, like they figured out what they're going to look like exactly, it's boring after maybe 2 or 3. It can be the most wonderful music, most complicated arrangements. I think in general, audiences subliminally are bored after 3 tunes like that.
Sure.
Because there's nothing, the musicians aren't taking it beyond what they've rehearsed for a performance. And whether people know it or not, that's just not interesting anymore. It's too contrived. And I think, music listeners, at least me, when I go to see music, I want to see someone go to the edge and go beyond what they've practiced. So that's kind of what I intend to do when I go play. on stage in the concert. If I'm going to a rehearsal, no, I'm focusing on how do the mechanics come together?
Mm-hmm.
How do we make this work? When I get on stage and I know that it's working, I just let it happen, and I hope that I'm inspiring the other players to drop any kind of preconceptions of how this music can be, because we've already rehearsed it. Let's just go for it now. Let's make it more interesting, because these people are they're connecting with us.
Sure.
They're, I think on a soul level, we're touching their souls. They're touching our souls. That energy is really why I became and stay with playing music. It's not anything to do with the notes that I've learned to play or any kind of licks or anything like that. So yeah, I think that's really what it is about. It's touching souls, just being open so people could connect. That's the most important thing about music performance.
Gotcha. And more currently, you've been playing with the Nell and Jim Band, also in the bluegrass genre.
Yeah, if not Americana. That's
sure.
why it's always difficult to make, because, and then again, we don't even play Americana because we've introduced songs from Poland recently. We have an accordion player in the band, so that kind of helps. We can get that sound.
Mm-hmm.
And he's fantastic, can play many, many styles. Yeah, that band is kind of reinterpreting old English songs and Scotch-Irish type of, Appalachian style music.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really sticking to one genre, so that's another difficult thing to sell. But what it is basically beautiful harmonies of Nell Robinson and Jim Nunnally, who have really authentic voices and blend so well together. So we're kind of showcasing that as the band. But then they allow us, with the arrangements, to play our own individual things, so that we bring that to the band. So yes, that's an exciting band that I've really been enjoying working with. Well, with the pandemic, it's really put everything on hold. But right before the pandemic, we had built that band up for about the last 4 or 5 years, and it was ready to really break open because we had done our third record, really good record, and we had a tour. We had 2 tours to Europe, a couple of tours through Canada, all planned, and everything got canceled. This is last, summer of 2020.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really messed the momentum of that band up, but we're coming back. We're going to come back strong. We've already done a few, controlled, social distanced concerts, and we've done some streaming. And Nell and Jim have done their own streaming from their own home and created their own little streaming show, the Nell and Jim Show.
Gotcha.
So, we're learning some new tricks. And during the pandemic, because I'm not rehearsing with other bands, I've been in my studio working on playing bass solos, like unaccompanied solos. And this is all kinds of melodic ideas coming from all kinds of worlds. I call it bass fiddling. I play with the bow a lot, mm-hmm. and I play fiddle tunes of all sorts. Of course, American fiddle tunes, but Irish tunes and jazz tunes, and from all eras. And so I'm learning how to accompany myself. And fiddle music basically is, first of all, I play the bass with a bow. So I've got that capability of playing more melodically with held out notes. And I play double stop, so I can play the harmonies, the roots below the melody. I throw that in. And a fiddle tune is a rhythmic tune, something that you can dance to. So exactly. It has some sort of rhythm. And I learned a lot in studying classical music when I fell in love with the Bach cello suites on the bass, performing this unaccompanied cello music, that these are fiddle tunes because those are melodic, harmonic. You're playing the chords as you go along, mm-hmm. and they're all different dances. These are Baroque dances, and they're kind of stylized now in the cello suite thing, but you have to have some kind of rhythmic element that puts a groove to that. So that's what fiddle music is. And I've incorporated that and used those techniques that I learned in the Bach cello suites to bring out, an Irish fiddle tune or a bluegrass tune. Yeah, so I have a whole book of arrangements that has not been published. I'm waiting to see where I'm going to go next with that, looking for, is there any interest in this? I get interest from classical players, classical bassists that go, wow, that'd be fun to play, but it's so I'm looking to eventually publish that, and that might be something that leads me somewhere else. And I've done performances, solo bass performances. But during the pandemic, I've spent a lot of time developing and memorizing these pieces. So they're not just now, I have them notated for someone else to read, but for me to play that and then improvise on the top of that. That's all something that I've worked on a lot lately because I'm not working with anyone accompanying me, so I've got to do it myself.
Gotcha. Well, and as you were mentioning in the pandemic, I did see a bit of the porch concerts with Nell and Jim, and
yeah.
I thought that was kind of a nice way to reach out where we couldn't be there on the porch, but at least we could kind of hear from a distance, some of the music and enjoy the performance. So that was definitely a nice touch. And as we've talked about, especially with your solo stuff, but in general, how are you getting your sound? What kind of gear are you playing on?
Well, first of all, I have an old German flat back bass, pretty nondescript, and basses are all different. I have about 4 different basses. I have one that I tour with, the small one in the corner. That one goes into a trunk that I take on the road because I can't really take a valuable bass on the road anymore. Sure. That changed many years ago, and it was always difficult even before that, putting it into a fiberglass case and worrying about it. So that's the biggest problem with being a string bass player and touring. There's that. Amplifiers, I have an old Walter Woods and I have, some decent speakers, but I have about 4 or 5 other amps that I use that are, appropriate for different gigs. But when I'm playing acoustically in an acoustic band, like with David Grisman, where, people are playing like really valuable mandolins and guitars that have this great rich tone, I make sure not to play too much with the pickup sound of the bass, because the pickup sound of the bass cuts through and changes the acoustic blend. So I use a microphone quite often, but I use a pickup blended through an apparatus called the tone dexter, which models my pickup tone to sound like whatever microphone I choose to model it to. Oh. That's a little hard to understand, but this thing called a tone dexter by Audio Sprockets is something that I'm not sponsored by it at all, but when I discovered it, it blew my mind. You put on headphones while you're training it, and you could hear it go as it's learning. You're just playing notes all over, and you're hearing it kind of go through these modulations until it finally trains itself, and then you program for that microphone. And so then when I go on stage, I plug my pickup tone, will go through this box. I'll show you the box. It's just a kind of a pedal kind of thing. And it was originally built for acoustic guitar players to get more of a microphone tone off their pickups, because that's the problem when you have a piezo pickup coming off the bridge. It's just picking up an edge of a bridge or maybe the heart of a bridge, depending on the pickup, and it's not picking up the full tone of the instrument, not the kind of thing that a microphone can do.
Sure.
But when you have a microphone, especially on stage with David Grisman, where he has all these recording microphones spread across the stage to pick up the guitar and the flute and the mandolin and the drums, then any kind of bass tone gets picked up by all of those microphones and interferes with their tone. So quite often I have to rely on a pickup sound because that's more controllable. And the pickup is not picking up anything, not picking up any bass drum or anything like that. It's just the hopefully, just the pure tone of the bass. Mm-hmm. Now modeled to sound like it's coming through a microphone. So I give the sound man a microphone tone because I use a DPA clip-on mic on the bass with the microphone underneath the bridge. Mm-hmm. And then I give him also, or her, the signal coming from my pickup, which is modeled to sound like a microphone.
Sure.
And I've always got really great response from the sound man saying, wow, I can't believe how much I could work with now. I could really fit you in the mix. It's not like I have to keep the bass down because the drums are picking up too much or the flute when I'm standing next to is picking up bass. So those are things that I pay attention to on stage. And quite often I'm fighting with sound people who have this rock sensibility because there's subwoofers under the stage or something like that, which completely messes up any kind of tone quality of a D28 that has this rich tone and big low end. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden that's blown out of proportion. And how do you fit a bass into that? Yeah. So you could hear it clearly. So these little devices and ideas that I picked up through the years is all about that, trying to make the bass very clear so I could hear the pitch, tone, and the tempo that I'm creating, which is the groove. So, that's kind of been my focus. It's not only learn the right notes,
sure,
fit in with the band, but also create tones that a sound person or an engineer in a recording studio can use.
Gotcha. And what kind of pickup are you using?
I use a Fishman full circle.
Okay.
That's the kind of pickup that's within the adjusters of the bridge. There's mm-hmm. little knobs on the bridge. And that gets us the center of the bridge. It's picking up the center of the bridge. There's other pickups. Other pickups could sound great with other basses. In fact, I have other basses where I use a realist. And and for those basses that pickup works good. So there's not one pickup that works. And they keep coming out with new things, and there's some new microphones that I'm very excited. There's one microphone that I would love to try out. I think it's called a Troll because it's a microphone that sits under the bridge.
Okay.
And it is a ribbon microphone, not a condenser microphone. And I found in recording sessions that ribbon microphones really work great on string basses, but they're very difficult to control in a live situation. And someone has put that together, and I'm going to look into that some more. So those are the things that I'm very interested in, this very natural tone and being able to bring, to mix into the, to get the proper mix and to create the sound groove that is appropriate for that music.
Gotcha. Well, and part of the challenge as well is if you've got your whole microphone set up, you're able to travel with your instrument, because I've heard from quite a few double bass players that they'll just get an instrument. Like if they're going to Europe, they'll get a loaner there, and then they have to figure out how to mic that. And one of the ones that recently we saw was Remic, and it's kind of a sponge assembly with a microphone, and it sounds like your Troll by description. Yeah. I think it fits under the bridge. And the thing they liked about it is that they could put it on whatever bass they ended up with and have a kind of, at least something that's constant, that gives them a more reliable output. But it is such a fascinating challenge because that's the whole electronic side. I remember I was reading a book by Chuck Traeger, who was an old luthier back east, and he'd spent, oh my gosh, he was still working on Ron Carter's bass well into his 90s. And he would do these little tweaks. He'd tell Ron, hey, I think I figured out something. Can I have the bass for a few days? And he might change the wood that he was using for the peg, because he'd decided that wood pegs gave you a different resonance than steel pegs. And I figured if I can shim this in this particular way, it's going to give you this much more projection, and just those tiny little nuances. And then with all of the possible electronics, you've got so many other additional options. So it's an ongoing process, and I think it's one of the reasons that a lot of the electric players maybe even went with electric because they're like, I'll plug into an amp and I'm pushing air and it's going to sound the way it's going to sound.
That's very true, because the electric bass is a lot more platonic. I mean, it's one Fender jazz bass or a Precision. They have a certain tone.
They do.
And it's kind of universal. And some are better than others, but in general, that's it. With an acoustic bass, every single bass is a different set of problems or, wonderful things. So that's something that I'll never, well, I got over it a long time ago. Any kind of advice that I would give, there's no generalities when it comes to getting the best electronic, using whatever electronics it is. And the generalities are basically, don't ever put out any more low end into your amp. Don't ever use your tone controls to boost any more low end than you need. Of course, you're not going to do that with the high end, because you can tell right away that that's abrasive.
Yeah.
But the low end, a lot of people tend to, when they plug their bass in, is first of all they turn it too loud. They turn their amplifier too loud, and they turn up the low end, thinking that, wow, that big warm sound. Well, that just translates to muffled boominess, where you can't hear the pitch and you can't hear the tempo.
Yeah.
And so I tend to always try to just get a nice, even, flat tone, which is basically not too much of any one frequency. So those are the general things that any bass player should know. And first of all, just don't ever turn up that loud. There are some players that, Jocko or whatever, that's an electric bass.
Yeah.
There are players that do turn up loud, and Eberhard Weber, who's one of my heroes, I loved him. And he always sounded like big and full. He took up the whole stage, because he was revolutionizing what a bass, how it fits into a band.
Mm-hmm.
And I admire that, but you can't do that for most bands. And of course, he was playing on an electric instrument, really. And if you tried that with an acoustic bass, you've got this resonating box that's just going to feed back and create all kinds of bad noises. So it's an ongoing thing. I'll never really get to the bottom of all of that, but I sure enjoy trying to get the best tone I can.
There you go. Well, and as we're mentioning the pandemic, and hopefully as we're coming closer to the light at the end of the tunnel, as there's more and more vaccinations, I'm happy every week I speak with another musician. There's more and more people vaccinated. That brings us closer to venues and possibilities of performance. What plans do you have for the future?
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, I've had to really soul search through this year and a half. Mm-hmm. The first thing I realized was, is this forcing me into retirement? I have to, and I have. I've looked at my retirement account, and I'm looking at my Social Security, and it's forcing me to be real about things. And I should be that way, because I'm almost 70 years old. But I just, up until before the pandemic, I never thought about retirement as anything in the present. But now it's kind of forcing me to think that way. So that's one thing. That's mostly what this has been, is me trying to come to grips with, am I going to be able to perform anymore? I mean, I had a lot of tours all booked, and I was ready to, because I love traveling, even though I have to bring a bass along. That's the worst part of traveling. But I love meeting people all over, and I really miss that. I actually in the bands that I've worked with, quite often I'm the driver, and I've enjoyed driving through this whole career. I'm typically the guy that goes off and rents the van, brings it back, picks the people up at the airport where the base is, and they, all of that is logistically made it for me to be a driver. And so I've missed driving through Colorado doing gigs and all of these wonderful places to drive. So what I did last month was buy myself a Ford F-150, and I'm going to put a camper on it. I'm going to make something that I can travel with my own bass, and go up and visit other musicians in Nashville, David up in Washington. I have various friends all over the country. I love driving. I mean, and seeing this country. Yeah. I just came back from a trip through Nevada, through the loneliest highway in the world, Highway 50, and drove for 10 hours straight and enjoyed every moment of it. It was like a meditation for me. Yeah. And I was alone. And I realized, wow, this is before I got this truck. And I realized, okay, I'm going to be like these people. Everyone's thinking about this, the van life idea, whatever. Sure. I want to give myself that option to just drive up the Oregon coast and stop wherever I feel like it and pull out my bass and play. Visit someone, other musicians, maybe, sit in with them or whatever. All of that I'm looking forward to doing, whether there's a pandemic or not going on. Sure. But I think all of us are realizing that we have to pay attention to our own health, which this pandemic has forced me to think about, but also the health of everyone around us, and also understand science, the science of microbiology, to realize that there are things that happen that we can't see, and we have to take a scientist's word for it, that these things can hurt us, and we can prevent that from happening, and we can be responsible. So those are things that I've learned a lot about in the pandemic. And I hope other people have too. There's lots of misinformation, and I tend to try to look for the facts and have critical thinking. This whole thing about anti-vaxxers, I have a really hard time with that. There's some people in my family that are talking that way, and no, I'm not going to allow that to happen. Personal freedom, that stops when it creates danger for the rest of the population. So those are big realizations on my part, but also most of the population have realized that we should be more responsible for each other's health, not to mention the healthcare system. Yeah. So
they're pretty worn out as it is.
Yes.
Well, and any plans to do any more work with Nell and Jim?
Yeah, well, we have. There's the gigs are starting to come in, trickling in, because the venues are. I'm telling you, I've had lots of dates on the calendar, for next summer that have been canceled, but still kind of hold them open because they might bring this venue back. So nothing is for certain right now. And I'm fine with that. I can live with that. Yeah. Because I've already kind of come to the realization that maybe this is retirement time. And my concept of retirement isn't necessarily that I'm not going to gig. It's just that I'm not going to rely on those gigs to pay the bills. So yeah, I think Nell and Jim, I think we'll probably restore some of the work that these festivals in Europe, because they're going to open up again, hopefully. And I don't know if we're going to be first on the list to be asked back, but this new record that we put out is a really fine record. It's called Western Sun, and it's got a lot of really interesting music on it. And the festivals were really interested to have us, but then for powers beyond our control, everything was canceled and postponed. So I'm just hoping that there'll be more work and more traveling and more bass playing.
Very nice, very nice. Well, and if people want to stay on top of Nell and Jim, it's nellandjim.com.
Yeah.
And is there any way that we can, kind of keep tabs on what you're doing in case you release your new book? Or
I don't really have a web presence.
Mm-hmm.
But you can contact anyone through the Nell and Jim website or even the David Grisman website.
Okay.
Because I'm still active with them, but we're just not performing that much. So yeah, that's the best way for that.
Very cool. Well, Jim, we appreciate you taking time to chat with us and tell your story and share your journey. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of interest, especially with your gizmo from the upright crowd. They'll go, what? There's something that'll do that? I need to know more. Folks, you've seen him here, Jim Kerwin on Bass Musician Magazine.
Thank you very much, Raul.